This lecture is a paleobiological lecture as opposed to being a more geological one, and you'll see that as we go through it. We're going to talk about eggs and nests. So we've known that dinosaurs were associated with and therefore laid eggs for a long time. Cope and Marsh found plenty of eggs in the 1800s. And then we've actually seen or collected some nests in the 1920s. That would have been R.C. Roy Chapman Andrews and the Central Asiatic expeditions to Mongolia. But really, it wasn't until the 80s that egg paleontology really took off to the point now where these things are actively sought and studied, and they're the subject of many, many research papers. And we have over 200 sites worldwide. So if we're going to talk about eggs, we have to start a little bit earlier, and that is sex, and even before that, selection of mates. And so for birds, we know that there is a lot of display. So you've got this peacock as an example here, and he will unfurl and flip and flash his brightly colored plumage, his feathers, his tail feathers, and that signals to females that he's a worthy and accessible male for mating, for breeding. And the thing is, a lot of dinosaurs, even before we thought of the dinosaur-bird connection, a lot of dinosaurs have features on their body like the giant frills and horns you see here on this ceratopsian, that signaled to paleontologists that maybe these things, at least for the males, were used for the same sort of deal. Display for females in a sexual selection process. It's not always display, sometimes it's vocalizations. The picture in the lower left, of course, is a beautiful little warbler singing away to attract mates, but that's also done by other creatures as well, and I deliberately picked the alligator above because they and birds have been taken as the most closely related organisms to dinosaurs in the past. We know it's birds now, and we'll talk about that later in the course, but for a long time it was thought it was crocodiloids, crocodiles, alligators, etc. But even they vocalize for mate attraction. So the big males will haul themselves out and they'll just do this loud bellowing noise that echoes all around the area to attract females. And we think that some dinosaurs probably did this as well, particularly the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, because a lot of them have various hollow cavities in their skulls and their sinuses, or great projections, crests off of their heads. We'll see that when we cover them later, that clearly would have had a large echoing, bellowing sound if air were forced through them. And so dinosaurs might have done it as well. Whatever they did, it's lost to science. We can't find it or see it anymore. Nonetheless, they find a mate. Well, then they have to have sex. And it's easy to imagine our bipedal dinosaurs doing this. They're already in this upright position. But people immediately went to the problem of, well, what about the giant sauropods? Things like Brontosaurus, Diplodocus, Camarasaurus, some of the bigger ones. These things weigh many, many tons. And they have giant long tails. Well, our best example, our only possible example, are our giant quadrupeds today. And the largest land mammal quadrupeds are the African elephants, and thus the picture of how they're doing it right here. So as weird and awkward or as funny as it might seem, even the giant sauropods probably would have had to done something like this and deal with giant tree trunk type sized tails that get in the way as well. There's no real evidence of this, but we can speculate. Nonetheless, we do have eggs, and so there's a definition of an egg right there. One of the key things is the amnion, this sort of pink tissue that surrounds the embryo and always keeps it bathed in moisture, keeps it wet, prevents it from desiccating, drying out. and then the shell, the outer hard shell. Dinosaurs thus are oviparous organisms. They exhibit oviparity, and there it is defined right there. And you see examples over here of oviparous creatures, reptiles laying eggs, this chicken, versus viviparous creatures like ourselves, and this tiger, where development in eggs is internal, and so they're not laid. The eggs are laid. We can collect them as fossils. Well, they have multiple shapes, it turns out. First of all, size-wise, these things range from as small as 2 centimeters, that's about an inch in diameter, to over 30 centimeters in length. And they have all of these different shapes. The most abundant type is what we call this prolate spheroid, this one that has the axes shown as it's measured here. And when people study these things, one of the first things they'll do is they'll take them out and they'll measure, all the different possible measurements of these things. The sphere is probably the least common, with prolate spheroids the most common. People examine the eggshell itself, and today, most reptiles, except turtles, and all birds have eggshells made of the mineral substance calcite, which is calcium carbonate. Some reptiles, like I said, it's like turtles mostly, but some others have these leathery eggs, which have some calcite in them, but they're mostly organic material. If we look at the crystalline structure of the eggshell, sort of cut it, slice it in here, and what you're looking at is a slice through the eggshell. The upper part above this picture is the outside world. Below it would be the developing embryo. The big thicker section right here is what we call the exospherite, which is the package of growing or grown calcite crystals. And then below that is the iospherite, which is an organic layer that is surrounding the embryo. And I should say that there are pores that go between most, not all, but most of these crystalline structures here that allow for gas exchange between the outside world and the developing embryo in here. If we look at the distribution of pores in eggshells, the distribution of pores in modern bird shells, they have far less of them than dinosaurs do. Dinosaurs typically have 8 to 16 times more, and more by either larger number or larger pore space than modern birds. And part of the reason we think for this is that birds lay their eggs out in the open. There is easy gas exchange, oxygen exchange with the atmosphere, whereas dinosaurs probably buried their eggs, either fully buried them or partially buried them in sediment, and so those environments would have lower oxygen contents, higher CO2 contents. They would need bigger pores or more pores, basically more pore volume space, in order for the gas exchange to occur. When we find dinosaur eggs, we always find them as clutches. So it's very rare to find an actual dinosaur egg alone. They typically are found in groups, and that indicates a paleobiological feature as well. It certainly indicates that all of those eggs were laid in a single episode. If we look at the data for what we have on dinosaur clutches, we have clutches as small as 2 and the largest up to 35. And this is definitely a character that's more like birds, which have smaller numbers, than reptiles. There are some reptiles that will lay 100 eggs, more. So birds, this is a more bird-like characteristic for these dinosaurs. What about brooding? We're all used to thinking of birds sitting on the nest to keep the eggs warm and protect them. Did dinosaurs do that? Well, it's hard to imagine a giant multi-ton creature sitting on fragile eggs, but perhaps they would, like in this diagram here, encircle them, stay there as they're developing, watch over them. And in fact, this picture is supposed to be a portrait of Maiasaura. That name literally translates as good mother lizard from Montana. It's from a place called Egg Mountain. The name says it all. It's a place where lots of eggshells in nests, as well as the bones of these adult female duck-billed dinosaurs are found, as well as juvenile dinosaurs. So it's sort of almost like a rookery, a place where there's lots of or animals in a certain group, a cohort, that are breeding all at the same time and taking care of young and producing young in one area all at the same time. This should have been earlier, but nonetheless, here it is. If we slice through those eggs and look at the different microstructures, again, you're looking at the calcite crystalline structure of these eggs. The upper row, these are modern reptiles, so lizard type things, turtle type things, alligator, crocodiles, gavials, etc. The lower row are dinosaurs, so dinosaur spherulitic, dinosaur prismatic, ornithoid is bird. But you see there's variety in all of these, but essentially it's growing a calcite crystal that is running perpendicular to the outer wall of the shell. If we look at all these egg types, I said before when we talked about trackways, it's almost impossible to assign a particular track to a particular dinosaur. It's just as hard with eggshells. You see here a lot of, well, possibly this form is possibly that. We don't know. We know for sure with the birds down here, and the rest is kind of possibly. They should have put possibly for everything up here down to birds, really. This was the case until we found and dealt with Oviraptor. Now, Oviraptor came from the American Museum revisiting all of Roy Chapman Andrews' sites and more in Mongolia, and they did it 50 years after he did it, 60 years after he did it. They're still going there. And one of the early things they found was this creature right here, and the skeleton you see is of a ferocious predator. You can see the claws up here and up here. So this clearly is a raptor and a predator, but then it is sitting on, or it's in association with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, perhaps more eggs. And so it was given the name Oviraptor, which translates to egg thief, because it was thought that this creature is coming here and it's stealing the eggs of the Protoceratops, the organism that Roy Chapman Andrews found as an egg layer back in the 1920s. This was the case then until they actually took one of these eggs and worked on it, prepared it, and found the bones inside, which is rare. Most dinosaur eggs don't have preserved embryos inside, but when they looked at this and did it, they found, oh, it's not a Protoceratops developing in the egg. It is a young Oviraptor. So this was not a raptor, a ferocious theropod stealing eggs from some poor other creature. It was a mother sitting on or watching on or basically brooding her nest. Let's talk about the nests themselves. Nests, we imagine, were either mound nests or hole nests. And this is common with reptiles today. You've got a mound nest, and birds do this too as well. You dig a small crater in the ground and perhaps cover it with vegetation or your body, etc., versus a hole nest where a hole is dug and eggs are put into it, then it's covered over. And a lot of people in this area have seen, of course, turtles, like snapping turtles and other turtles doing this on the side of creeks and roads and things like that. However they did it, or had it, a lot of dinosaur nests have the eggshells aligned. Now look at this. These things are clearly not just randomly thrown in there. Mom didn't just bloop these all out and lay them like this. She laid them and then adjusted them, aligned them. And birds and some reptiles do this today for consideration of insulation or thermal regulation, regulating the heat of these developing eggs, but also you just have to constantly turn them, like a chicken will turn them to prevent the developing embryo from sticking to one side of the shell, so they'll constantly be turned. So clearly then, these dinosaurs were also paying attention to these eggs. They were giving parental care to their developing young while still in the egg. This almost certainly had to have involved some sort of forelimb usage, using of their arms and hands, not just their snouts, because we're talking about careful manipulation of these things. If you look at this picture right here, here is a small raptor, and it's pretty easy to imagine this creature right here. It barely grew up to the height of your waist, and it had big, large, well-developed hands. It's easy to imagine this mother carefully manipulating and adjusting her eggs with her hands in this nest, which is partially exposed, partially buried. But go back to Maiasaura. Maiasaura was a giant, multi-ton creature which didn't have well-developed hands. Instead, she had more hoof-like structures up here. So she was, and yet we find Maiasaura nests also with aligned eggs. She was clearly not adjusting them with her forelimbs, and that probably was snout adjustment. Interesting stuff. To go to something that's brand new, within the past month, there's been reported some interesting fossils from China again of this animal called Psittacosaurus, which perhaps showed what we call courtship signaling. When we look at the fossil of this Psittacosaurus, the upper picture are the bones, the lower picture is the artist's representation. You see the bones up here, but then below it, what was initially thought to just be smears or smudges on the rock, when they carefully prepared it, you can see all kinds of structures, and it turns out it is a preserved cloaca. Cloaca is basically a multi-purpose hole that birds use for transfer of sperm and eggs. They poop and pee out of this thing, and they lay eggs out of this thing. And this is yet another bit of evidence that sort of cinches or ties dinosaurs and birds as most closely related groups. In fact, birds are avian dinosaurs. That's what we call them now. And all of these big things, like Psittacosaurus, are our non-avian or non-bird dinosaurs. We think it's that much of a connection there. And again, these things would have also had, as they do today, both their sight and scent, they're used for courtship signaling. So the males are doing all kinds of signaling to get mates. The females are also doing signaling to show that they are available, are primed and ready for the process that gives us eggs, which gave us dinosaurs.